Hello there. Welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. Sometimes the music is weird. The majority of the time, I'm weird. It's the Strange Music Show, of course. Anyway, in today's episode, we will once again be continuing our foray into the sonic assaults of Swans, with a look at a very interesting and somewhat notorious album within their entire discography. And so, as I mentioned in the previous episode covering Holy Money, the small majority of you who voted in the poll were in favour of covering the live albums, which I think is a great choice from you lot, as I'm actually rather unfamiliar with most of the live albums, to be fair with you. Even though one of my absolute top favourite Swans compositions only comes from a live album. More on that in future though. Anyway, after hearing this one though, I can really understand why the live albums and stuff are just so revered, amongst Swans fans. It makes so much sense, to be fair. So yeah, we're going to be taking a dive into what is actually the first semi-official live album release from Swans. The brutal, atonal and downright depressingly bludgeoning experience of Public Castration is a Good Idea. Goodness me. So, this is without a doubt one of the most brutal offerings within the entire discography, I would argue. It just consolidates so much of that no-wave atonal just brutality and just shows it off in this live setting. It's amazing. And so Public Castration, it consolidates the various tracks from Greed and Holy Money, all performed on the 1986 tour through London and Nottingham. And what an onslaught this is. My goodness, there's only a couple of tracks on this, well, a handful of tracks, but my goodness, this just goes for it, I think. But before we get into the meat of all, let's of course ask ourselves the question, who were Swans? Well, for this live album, and I guess this general tour as well in 1986, Swans consisted of Michael Gira, Norman Westburn, Algiers Kizias, Jarbo, Ronaldo Gonzalez, and Ted Parsons, all of whom we've discussed in the previous episodes for Greed and Holy Money, of course, and various others, etc. And so, what is Public Castration is a Good Idea then? Well, it's a semi-official bootleg, apparently, of various live performances from the ICA and the ULU in London and the Garage in Nottingham. And incidentally, it seems that this was also the very first live album from the band, a terrifying document of the sonic dissonance that is a part of those very early shows, I'm excited to talk about this one, it's truly brutal and just so nasty, but it's phenomenal to listen to, I would say. And so this album, this album itself, it's been released a couple of times here and there over the years, but its first release was actually back in 1986 on vinyl, with the catalogue number of Burn 1. And it has since been released on CD and vinyl through Thirsty Ear, Mute, and of course Young God Records. Alongside its compact disc release by Thirsty Ear in 1999 though, there was actually an accompanying video cassette on both Betamax and VHS of the same tour that was also released, titled A Long Slow Screw, being the very first live video of the band available commercially for people, which is, I think, phenomenally interesting stuff. And it was for the episodes in Greed and Holy Money we used footage from A Long Slow Screw actually for the various track playing. So here's the context for them. But let's just dive into these songs then, shall we? Let's dive into each one of them. Public Castration is a Good Idea. It opens up with a 12-minute rendition of Money is Flesh, a track featured on both Greed and Holy Money. And so, when we talked about this track in both of the videos, I mentioned how this was one of those Swan songs I didn't rate all that much, essentially, due to there being a lot of elements in the mix, both on the Greed version and the Holy Money version, that, I'm just not a big fan of, essentially. However, on this album, on this live performance of Money is Flesh, we're given the slowest crawl with this track that just brutally pushes with this nasty and absurdly low-end bass that just takes ages and ages to even get to the song itself, essentially. The album itself, it just opens up with this terrifying, heavy, monolithic and atonal dirge that just makes the track far more interesting to me than its album counterparts for some reason. I don't really know why, but I just like it here because I'd argue that the track is being presented in a style much more akin to the likes of Filth and Cop, I would say, And as a result of that, you're getting much more emphasis on that heavy low-end drops on the specific rhythmic structure, though, whilst Westberg guitar, of course, screeching with that horrid dissonant buzz in the background. And then when Jira just starts howling out, there's such an anguished string to his voice with such emphasis on that very structure being established by the whole band. And there's just something so nasty, so horrible, and yet so satisfying about, the entire thing as a result. And I don't know why, but I find this particular live version here, of Money is Flesh just be so much better than the album versions I've mentioned. I mentioned it in the videos. I wasn't a fan of the looped brass section that's so prominent on the original recordings, but on this version, it's just all been slowed way down to this really proper sludgy, doomy level. It just feels like you're waist deep in the thickest mud, just pushing through as explosions are just going off overhead, and you're just overloaded and bombarded with noise. And what I love as well is how the track doesn't build up to anything substantial, but instead it just continues the crawl for the entirety of those 12 minutes. And I imagine other people might find that odd and weird, but I just love it when Swans indulge in the monolithic push, and as a result you just get lost in the constant onslaught of rhythmic assault. Hard to explain, but there is something truly brilliant about it as a result. Moving on then, we get an 8-minute version of Fool for the second track, which, like the previous track, also appeared on both of Greed and Holy Money. And so, just to go back to the previous versions, I mentioned mostly on the video for Holy Money how both album versions have its strengths and weaknesses, of course, much like the previous track we just discussed, actually. For this version, though, just like the last one, it's been turned into this slow monolithic crawl, where the heavy descent on those very piano notes just rumble and rattle throughout the entirety of the room itself. And to me, it's a fantastic rendition of this track, and I'm not entirely sure why, but this truly brutal and atonal version of the track that just slowly pulls itself along, carrying with it this immensely heavy weight. It's just such a vast improvement on the album's counterparts, in my opinions. It's like, it seems to just frame the very core strengths of the track much more strongly than those album versions, where I would argue it kind of got lost in terms of experimentation. They were trying new ideas, which is great, but it just didn't gel together for some reason, for me anyway, of course. And with this version though, it's just so brutal as a result. It just pushes with this absurdly slow tempo. And the music itself is almost naked with its absurdly stark and bleak presence, though, And what I find interesting about this one as well is how, once again, very little build-up to anything, but instead just pure, empty, unchanging atmosphere for just 8 or so minutes. And it should be said, Jira's performance just becomes louder and more guttural and expressive for certain lines towards the end of the song, sounding so incredibly strained and stretched as he holds on to those notes for such impressive amounts of time. And as a result, truly a brilliant track on this album, a perfect encapsulation of the absurdly bleak and uncomfortable era of early Swans in all its slow, monolithic, atonal glory. So, Public Castration moves on to its next track of A Screw, leading in from the last one directly with a continuation of the very drum pattern that it ends up occurring for well over a minute before anything else enters the scene in this song. But after such a bleak and almost overloading experience of Fool, having this really long introduction to A Screw, it gives us this unusual moment of respite as though we're entering the factory itself, listening to the incredibly loud machinery just clanging away in its rhythmic patterns before, Jira just starts shouting and it's howling, of course. And having just Jira and the drums open up this very track, it just gives us this very unusual presence, a very peculiar sense of heaviness before you even get any bass and guitars in it. But when they do arrive, they're so loud and atonal, just screeching away as the drums just continue that industrial pattern. And I love the final stretch of this version of the track though. You're getting this cataclysmic, overbearing explosion from the band that are just pushing that slow tempo still, as Gira is just howling and howling this quasi-religious imagery from the track. The incredibly heavy and repetitive structure of the performance just makes it so mesmerizing as you get pulled into this really, uncomfortable soundscape. And I would say it's perhaps a highlight on this whole recording, in my opinion, with the band being so tight as they just land on those really specific notes from the drums just slamming away, just carrying the entire band's heavy low-end atonal notes, Goodness, to me, this is one that just gets you right here with just the level of intimidation and just how just overloading and overbearing this whole thing is. Anyway, we move on. We get the next track, Anything For You, which opens up with a continued reprise of the previous track's lyrics, Gira is just singing a cappella over the room tones itself, just howling out the repetitive refrain of Holy as the instruments just start feedbacking, screeching and whining and just filling up the room with those tones. But then of course the drums start, and once again it's another incredibly dirgy monolithic crawl towards this bleak atonal landscape. And this one, it just pushes so much of that absurdly dark and uncomfortable setting that this whole live performance is presenting to us, So much emptiness, but sudden bursts of loudness and of course the absurdly slow tempos, of course. But it's crazy, it made me realise though how crazy at these very shows just how huge and expansive such minimalist playing ended up being, if that makes sense. Like, when I hear these recordings, there is something so huge about it all. The rattles and unnatural echoing reverberations around the very room itself, turning these single descending heavy notes into these incredibly heavy experiences. And for me, it's perhaps one of the main powers of Swans as a band, I feel, taking advantage of almost minimalist notions to create something that's incredibly maximalist as a result, And it comes across so incredibly well on this track, as it just pounds and pounds away with that rhythmic skeletal structure being provided by the bass and the drums. And what a phenomenally bleak and unsettling performance, It's so guttural and so empty inside, and this is perhaps one of my favourites on the whole album, I would argue, especially when Gira is just hitting that refrain of I'll do anything for you, just howling it out almost as though he's entirely alone and nobody is hearing it, just a call into the eternal void. Moving swiftly along though, we end up at what is actually arguably, a fan favourite of fans of Swans, and that is a live rendition of Coward. And so this one continues so much of what Public Castration is presenting, which is the slowest, heaviest version of Swans that was existing at the very time. And the drums are just pounding and colliding, to push the whole proceedings along, but man, it's so atonal almost, so low in the registers, so incredibly dirgy as it just pummels along with this really intimidating presence. And I love the drumming on this one, it does the slow monolithic thing, of course, But then, the more the song progresses, you're getting these rolls across the very drum itself, almost lifting the song out of that dirgy miasma, even if it's only for the fewest and most briefest of moments when that drum rolls across, of course. But at the forefront of this one, lying atop those drumming is the screeching feedback of guitars, is Gira just howling, screaming, and shouting with such an incredibly scary performance, right? And there's even a bit where he doesn't even say words, but just repeats ah and sha over and over again, whilst in the background you're getting this really peculiar squeak that accompanies those very non-words so perfectly for some reason. And that's before Gira just goes into this extended growling section, of course. But my goodness, this is truly a powerful performance from Swans, and it really showcases that maximalist, brutalist nature of so much of what they do as a band. And on such an atonal album, I find it weird that perhaps one of the most musical tracks on the whole thing, this is perhaps one of the most musical tracks on the whole thing, if that makes sense, but maybe to me that's in part to how the rhythmic structure of the track itself almost fills in the gaps of that really atonal playing, if that makes sense. It all just comes together so brilliantly on this one, and easily one of my favourite tracks on this very live album, I would say. and so, moving on, we get to the longest song on Public Castration, and that is the 12.5-minute rendition of A Hanging. Now this one, I don't know how, but it somehow managed to build up upon and extend the incredibly brutal nature of the previous tracks, and just sent the entire thing further down into the incredibly dark atmosphere, further into the uncomfortable, macabre presence that this whole album is presenting to us, right? But this one is so unusual at times, once again, doing much of what we should expect from Swans, from the album, slow drums, atonal stars, etc, etc, etc. But there's some different ideas being explored in this one that I find really interesting as a result, it's mostly within that structure, you're getting this very loud build-up of cataclysmic noise from the guitars, that whip the entire performance up into this unusual frenzy before it stops to let the drums hammer away for 2 hits before building it all up once again, And it's with each hit on that very final note from the drums before the musicians just start building that horrible, terrifying soundscape again. And I love the powerful emphasis on that drum hit. It makes it so intimidating when it just bam and just comes in and happens, and then you just get that turmoil, that frenzy. Weirdly enough though, this really reminded me of the kinds of things that Swans would actually start doing and really explore in phenomenal detail in their much later records, And that's where, especially during the live shows for the trilogy albums, you have these really big expanses of sound being built up from the various instruments. And they create this incredible whirling miasma of noise that just builds up and up and up, and it just becomes so overwhelming and incredible. But one of the beautifully powerful things about Swans and what they do. And to me, on this particular track, it feels like a very early genesis of that kind of thing they'd be exploring in those later years. Here, I would say it's a bit more controlled, arguably, especially with that stop-start rhythm from the drums, But I think it's so interesting. You can, when you listen to early Swans, you can kind of see just little hints of things that they would, just take a look at and then just really just go wild with in their later records. It's very cool how they do that. But anyway, going back to the track though, you get this extended outro section where the drums move away from that slow tempo though that they've been doing so much of, to allow this almost faster paced drum pattern to just start pushing the song towards the ending, backed up by mostly the screaming and shouting of Gira's performance. And the more it goes on though, the more intense those drums become, before turning into this really intimidating portion of the track itself, there's so much power and presence on this recording, and although I keep saying it a lot on this album, it's another highlight, I think, across the entire thing. It just has so much going on for it, and just anytime I hear this version of a hanging, it just fills me with this existential terror right to my very core again. Man, it really just really gets to you. But continuing right along though, we actually come to what is the shortest track on the album, and that's the 5.5-minute version of Stupid Child. And so this one, I think is brilliant again, as they all are on this album, After the count-in, which follows him from what I assume, you're getting this long intro, where drums are having this chatter from the audience, but you can hear an audience member just howling up the lyrics to Cop in what I assume is an attempt to get the band to play it at the show. Good effort. But you get the count-in, and then you get that heavy drumming accompanied by absurdly angular guitars that sound so janky and broken. And this track is one that sounds so distorted and nasty though, and it works so absurdly well as a result. And all the instrumentals, the vocal performance in this one just culminate in such an ugly, distorted mess of discordance and loud noise. And there's something so visceral about it all though, as though you're being repeatedly punched right in the gut, with each and every slam on the drum kit. It's so intimidating, so scary, and so absurdly loud and nasty, but there is something truly brilliant and monumental about the fact. It just slams away with no respite as it crawls along to the end of the track, just laden with feedback and noise, It's another brilliant moment on this album, and one that continues the horrible, nasty onslaught in such terrific fashion, never once letting up for a moment, or even giving the audience any room to just breathe. And so, the final track of this album is a 10-minute version of Another You, which opens up with this incredibly low-end murmuring of bass notes and a sort of weird sense of dark ambient drone as the track just emerges from the thick tarry substance, before you're just bombarded with this incredibly sudden and loud distorted guitar that rattles and rings across your very skull when it occurs. And once again, it's a very long introduction, but its various movements and dynamics end up creating this rather confusing little experience for us, as the very instruments themselves, it's almost like they're being bastardized as they just howl out with noise and feedback for the most part. And of course, to attempt to bring it all back down to earth, you've got the slow rhythmic crawl of the drums again, pounding away with such precision as it lands on those final heavy emphasized beats, establishing that slow tempo for Gira to just croon over the entirety of. And what a brilliant way to end this live album, I would argue. It just culminates so much of what has been established on this very performance, I would argue. Just delivering to us, just giving it straight back to the incredibly noisy atonal dirge that mixes in some incredibly loud drones at the beginning, before going into those quintessential Swans movements, of course, right? But this one, it's like the final battering though. You've entered the room and you've been completely assaulted, by the brutality of the performance, only for it to just deliver it back tenfold with the final track here. And a further slamming of the sledgehammers on your very head as it just rings out with its nauseating headache, only for the song to suddenly build up the atonal discordance as it progresses towards the end. And I think there's actually some wonderful guitar work from Westberg, at this bit, hidden in just within the mix a bit, after a slight pause from the drum, where it just rings and rattles with this very odd little tone before, Gira is just shouting, screaming, and howling down the microphone with such, intimidating presence, right? But I find this outro to the track to be incredibly weird and hypnotic. It's like the swinging of the pendulum again, just pulling you into that crazy miasma. But it's been a wonderful build-up to this very point on the album across the whole thing, and I feel, Swans have truly delivered by having this as the final track on the album. It's a truly powerful and frightening performance to close off what I would argue is one of the most brutal live albums ever released, maybe. And so with that, I think we have essentially covered the now very infamous live album Public Castration is a Good Idea by Swans. And I should say, you know, like I have mentioned a couple of times, I'm not all too familiar with the live albums from Swans before diving into this one. I'd say it's probably the first time I really gave a live album by Swans, a lot of my time, if that makes sense. And I have been aware of the other ones, so heard bits and pieces, but never really sat down and listened to one properly until I started reviewing this one for the channel. And I get it though, because there's just something so powerful and frightening and so brutal about the very performance itself that I can see why people don't just regard this very album, but the many live releases from the Swans, and the shows themselves that by Swans just being incredibly important to the band's identity as a whole, And I have to say, I'm fascinated by seeing how it's all going to develop and change as we dive further and further into the Swans discography. As we see the genesis of such early Swans material here on Public Castration. That I think it's been incredibly informative, to be truth be told. And it's all just downright brilliant in its own right, though. But what a phenomenal album that it really sort of fills in a lot of the questions and theories and just sort of opinions I have regarding greed and holy money, and now it makes much more sense, I would say. And so with that, we've come to the end of our episode of Weird Music. This has been a really weird album to dive into by Swans, but I have been so curious about this particular live album, and having dived into it, I can, it seems very important amongst the whole Swans canon and their discography. Like I've mentioned, it's easily one of the most brutal albums I've come across, with this unrelenting discordance and atonal performance that just warps you into this really unusual headspace. So of course, in future episodes, we're going to be looking at more live albums by Swans and Swans, but our next episode on Swans will be a dive into the 1987 album of Children of God, which I'm rather excited but also quite nervous to dive into for some reason. I do hope I can get it round in time, but this one might take some time to talk about. I just have a feeling that this is gonna weigh a bit, to take a bit of time for some reason. But it should be interesting. I'm really excited to really get into the grit of it. For now though, I would like to thank you for watching this episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye!